y'all again for being here. Alan's talk has really set us up nicely for the rest of today and tomorrow. And I'm going to introduce an invisible person. So this was imagined as a conversation that Katina and I would have with the wonderful Stacy Hartman, who ended up bogged in Oregon. And so she is so sad not to be here. But I want to still introduce her and acknowledge her role in helping think about this and her work with us over the years. And also, they'll take the moment to say, if you go to the website version of the program, in addition to the full biographies, you'll see that for each person is linked a thought piece. And we kept the tradition we followed throughout the Humanities for the Public Good of inviting our guests to try to do something that actually aligns nicely with what Alan was asking for, which is to write a very informal conversational thought piece about a shared question. In this case, about what does graduate education, or what do we want for the future of humanities graduate education. And I have to say, these are some of the most delightful pieces of writing I have read over the last 4 years, when people just sort of let themselves relax into their more colloquial scholarly voice and just ponder. And so we have several years of several symposia of these thought pieces, which are all fascinating. But Stacy's is there, and I hope you'll find time to read it along with Katina's. So an introduction to a ghost and an introduction to an actual present person. Stacy Hartman and Katina Rogers have been two of the most influential figures in envisioning, shaping, advising, documenting, and mentoring grad students and graduate faculty throughout the ground-shifting crises that have somehow become the norm in the humanities and hence in graduate education over the last decade. Stacy Hartman has worked for the Mellon Language Association, directed the multi-million-dollar Mellon Grant Transforming Doctoral Education for the Public Good at the Graduate Center at CUNY, and co-edited the recently published Modern Language Association collection titled Graduate Education for a Thriving Humanities Ecosystem. And this is a great collection from people all over the country who have been doing work in the area of graduate education, including an article that Jennifer New, our former associate director, and I wrote about the Graduate Institute that now has moved into the Office of Engagement and really become a wonderful, full-fledged, year-long program. Katina Rogers, after working tirelessly in many capacities, including overseeing the MLA's Humanities Commons platform as an editor, directing the Futures Initiative, I love the name of this, at CUNY, co-directing the CUNY Humanities Alliance and the internationally influential Haystack, Humanities, Arts, Sciences, Technology, Advanced Collaboratory. I memorized that long ago. So Katina has really transformed national conversations. And that was especially true with her blockbuster book from 2020 entitled Putting the Humanities PhD to Work, Thriving in and Beyond the Classroom. And I have to say that if you have, we've had a discussion with Katina about the book. She's been interviewed and reviewed everywhere. But if you want a really humane, thoughtful, very frank discussion of the state of graduate education in the humanities and all kinds of creative solutions or suggestions about where to go in the future, we should all read and again this book. So thank you for that, Katina. So if we look above us, one of the things Katina and Stacy have both moved into is an area a number of people in the humanities are finding a home, which is working for themselves and consulting. So do you want to talk about your logo, Katina?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Teresa. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. Thanks for organizing this along with your team, with Lauren and Aaron. It's One of the things that has really struck me since getting here yesterday has been the incredible warmth that people have for one another, and the excitement for being a part of this program. And that's really a testimony to all of the work that's been done over the years. I mean, I think that that sense of connection and community is really palpable. So thank you for letting me be a part of it. It's incredibly humbling to have that introduction when there's so many leaders in graduate education reform in the room. Yeah, it feels a bit daunting actually to rise to that. So, but I'll do my best. So, yeah, the logo, and maybe a little bit of how we got there. I mean, I think it's really unfortunate that Stacy couldn't be here. She and I have had really similar and parallel paths, and have shifted from the maligned category of university administrators to the maligned category of consultants. But it's been a very interesting space to be. One of the reasons that I made that shift, which I did shortly after the book came out, was because I found that I was doing a lot of quick drop-ins to different institutions, having a chance to talk about some of the things that I had been seeing, some of the things that I thought might be possible, and then I would jump right back out, you know, and I wanted a chance to be able to dig in more deeply. And so it's been really amazing to have a chance to work in a more sustained way with a few organizations at a time, most of them universities, but not all, and to think about ways to operationalize, ways to systematize, ways to embody the kinds of changes that I talked about in the book. My logo I'm very fond of because a big part of my thinking over the last few years, not only in my consulting work but also in my writing and research, has been around mushrooms, as Alan mentioned. And in fact, the question that I think Lily asked right at the end of that session about what might need to die in order for other things to grow in their place has been one of the really formative questions I've been asking myself, particularly since COVID. So the book came out in 2020. I was supposed to be out here in person at that time, actually. And one of the things that I reflected on in the book was that there's always been this rhetoric around the humanities being in crisis. And I found that to be not a particularly compelling line of rhetoric. And then COVID hit, and we really were in a crisis. And in fact, I felt like it was important to, not be throwing around terms like that, because in certain moments like that, the immediacy, the urgency, the impact was so much more significant, and we needed a way to describe that. So, but in the midst of all that, there was this kind of shedding of many, many things within universities, both in good ways and in bad. I mean, I think in some senses there was a shedding of many of the things that felt a bit arbitrary, requirements around being in person, requirements around certain modes of engagement. There was also shedding of jobs. There was shedding of, the kinds of benefits and ways of being that people were had been able to do in years past. And I had hoped in that moment that following that shedding, that there might be a chance to rebuild in a way that actually took into consideration the things that that people were talking about as being valuable. Was there a way to think about the kind of person-to-person connection that we were seeing in mutual aid efforts in that moment, for example? Might there be a way to think about how we support graduate students and how the physical sustenance of someone in that role has an impact on the kinds of research that they're able to do? Might there be a way to, think about what it means that we've been shifting the core area of work in universities towards adjuncts dramatically over the past decades, and start to push back against that? And as we've kind of shifted back towards normalcy, or something posing as normalcy, I'm not convinced that we have. And so I am still getting to the logo. I started to think a lot about what might need to pass, and what might be growing in its place, or what we might find in its place if we made a little bit more room. At the same time, I had recently read Anna Lowenhut Singh's amazing book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, And I was also stuck at home with my little kids all the time because of COVID, and we had nowhere to go except Prospect Park and Greenwood Cemetery. And we were there day after day after day and season after season. And as a result of that repeated kind of walking of those paths and noticing the same things changing over time, I don't know about them, they were little, but I started to notice things that had been there all along, but I had never seen before. And mushrooms were the thing that really encapsulated that for me. I realized that there had been all of this growth that was always happening that just hadn't caught my eye before and couldn't catch my eye if I was moving too quickly, or if I was looking up instead of down, or if I was thinking about, a rotting log as a rotting log instead of a place that might foment growth. And as I thought about that, the idea of mushrooms really came to hold a pretty dominant place in my imagination as a place, a metaphor for what we might think about. Oh, yay, here's my mushrooms. Thank you. What we might think about as the possibilities in a university that does allow some things to fade. Can I keep talking about mushrooms? Okay. And also just connecting back to Alan's talk on usefulness, I think that putting the Humanities PhD to work was hopefully a useful book. I think it's a book that was meant for people to be able to read it, to hold it, to talk about it, and hopefully to do something about it. The work I've been doing around mushrooms is not that useful, but it has allowed me to tap into a space of curiosity and uncertainty and indeterminacy that I think is also something that's really important about humanities inquiry. So some of the things that I've been thinking about with mushrooms, I'm going to start by mentioning the picture that's on the bottom right, which is actually not a mushroom. It's a plant called Monotropa uniflora, or ghost pipes. They're completely white. They don't have any chlorophyll or chloroplast. They can't photosynthesize, so they can't make their own sugars. But they're fully a plant in every other way. So in order to grow, they have to get their sugar from somewhere. And the way that they do that is through connections between their roots and the mycelia of certain species of mushrooms. So the mycelia are like the underground roots that form the main mass of the mushroom. They connect with the mycelia of the mushroom. The mushroom is also connecting with other species of plants. And so the sugars are actually moving from, say, a species of tree that's photosynthesizing through the intermediary of the mushroom into this plant that then can grow. So it's not a plant that you can just, drop a seed in the ground and hope that it will come up. You need this complex multi-species ecosystem, and even then, maybe it will grow, maybe it won't. So I was thinking about that in terms of what are the ways in which we have all these collaborations and points of connection that are constantly happening in university spaces, but that don't always have a clear, linear goal to them. Maybe something's not going to come of this, but maybe it will. And I think that, all the ways in which we have conversations in the hallways, the ways that we're gathering here, sharing cups of coffee, all of those points of connection are some of these mycelia that something might spring from, or maybe not. Two other things, and then I'll stop talking about mushrooms. One is that they're super tiny. So this one on the bottom right, if you saw it on a log, it just looks like a little white splotch, almost like paint or something. But when you look at it through a hand lens, you can see this really intricate structure. And so that, too, to me, felt resonant to realize that there are some things that are very easy to overlook, and that, in fact, have a real depth to their beauty and possibility. And one of the things I'm grappling with this is that sometimes projects or collaborations need to stay a bit hidden in order to thrive. Sometimes if you pull them out and put a hand lens on them and shine a light on them, that's going to cause them to fade away. So how do we cultivate those spaces of kind of tiny possibility without destroying them before they have a chance to really grow. And then the last is the top left picture, which are turkey tail mushrooms, which are one of my favorites. They're so beautiful, and in the Northeast where I live, they're really abundant. They're really powerful medicinal mushrooms, and they grow on rotting logs. And so this, to me, I mean, the decomposing factor of mushrooms, the fact that they are returning nutrients to the soil, that they're taking something that could have been discarded, that it might be seen as waste or something that's like marring the beauty of a landscape, and in fact they produce something completely new and sometimes very powerful. Sometimes they will kill you, but sometimes they're something that can really bring life and health and sustenance. So that's why I chose the logo and the name for my company that I have. Ink-cap mushrooms are really fun to think about. They're also decomposers, and they like self-digest, and as they do, the cap turns into this really dark, inky black. And people have used it in the past to sign documents in ways that would be difficult to forge because you can see the spores under the microscope. And so I find that to be a really, just something that I think about a lot as I'm working. Like, what are the metaphors of how different possibilities come to rise and how we encourage them to thrive without stifling them.
That's so fascinating, Katina, and it's such a good reminder that for all the heartbreak and hardness and differential difficulty of COVID, that those of us in the humanities, I think, did do a lot of rethinking. And I keep thinking to myself, when people were first saying at the end of COVID, let's get back to normal, I was like, no, I have no interest. One, what was normal? And two, normal wasn't always great. And so I just love the way you're giving us a chance to think about change. Yeah. And two, to take that in the direction of grad education, when we say grad education, very often, at least around here, we really mean PhD. Mm-hmm. It's as though we've forgotten that there are graduate certificates and there are master's degrees. There are a range of structures. Mm-hmm. And I think in a lot of ways, some of us were talking about this at dinner last night, what is most at risk, especially in relation to employment, is the PhD. Mm-hmm. And that, in fact, some of the other structures of graduate education might be those mushrooms that are thriving. And we'll hear from Catherine Temple about one example after lunch today, the Georgetown example, and from others too. But I wonder what you see in graduate education. What are those mushrooms that we might be walking right past?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, I think that so much of it comes down to relationship. Like, for me, the more I think about the programs like HPG, for example, and many of the others that will be talked about later today and tomorrow, the programs that are most inspiring are the ones that are really humanizing, that really emphasize points of connection between people, the ways that people work together and build relationships. But that's not something that you can script, right? That's not like you can't, go into an institution cold and say you're going to build really great relationships starting tomorrow. It's something that takes a lot of time and, kind of the magical and uncertain chemistry of how people get along together and how they work together and what kinds of ideas are sparked together. I think that relationship is one of the things, and I think that includes lots of kinds of informal relationship, both within the university and in lots of other spaces. One of the things that I think can create really productive possibilities within universities is when students have enough time and space to pursue hobbies that they used to love and haven't had time to do anymore, and just being able to keep those different strands of how we think and who we're connecting with and in what ways alive is something that feeds back into the scholarship and feeds back into the teaching. So relationships are one big thread. I think the other thing that is also very hard to create structurally is time held aside, finding ways for there to be kind of a container of time and space. And I think this is why the PhD in particular is so important, is its duration and the amount of time that it affords for deep thinking. But on a smaller level, how can we, students are so pressed for time, faculty and staff are so pressed for time. We're constantly running ourselves too thin. A lot of that is structural at the level of the university, and choices around adjunctification that have happened over decades, with the result that nobody has enough time for this kind of thing. And I think that that's kind of the negative side of usefulness and instrumentality, that everything we're doing has to be towards a goal because there's not enough time to get everything done otherwise. And so how can we, within our programs, hold some of those spaces open just a little bit more, because I think that that's where the really interesting thinking can happen.
And, I often reflect on the fact that when we talk about graduate programs, or someone's talking about starting a new master's, you almost never hear people talk about students first. The question of what is the need we perceive that we might speak to through X. The PhD, the need was professors, training professors to go out and be employed in academia. That need doesn't really exist much anymore, and it's we're all anxious about how much it's going to exist and how much less it might exist in the future, or exist differently. But there's also a way, continuing with your metaphor, and also with some of the things Alan said about reframing, there's a way in which, if being a professor is not the end goal, that actually opens space to rethink everything from undergrad up in ways that could be delightful and meaningful. But I want, and one of the things I know a number of you participated in is when we brought the people from humane metrics for the arts, for the humanities and social sciences, and they really resisted our instrumentality in, and they really questioned the way we talk about teaching, research, and service as ends rather than means to an end. That was so helpful to me. And if we instead, as they want us to do, start with values, and then really think about who those values serve, but also audience. What is work for? What is knowledge for? Which is back to useful in a certain way. I wonder if we have that thought experiment, what could graduate work in the humanities be for?
Yeah, I love that thinking of shifting from that kind of triangle from being the ends to being the means to an end. And I think that this is something that I wrote about in my piece that's online, but I think that a lot of times when we can get out of the way of what students are thinking about anyway and what they're wanting to do, that some of that question of what it can be for becomes really apparent. I mean, I've been doing work over the last few years, in particular around innovative dissertations, and they're incredible. Like it's so frustrating to work on in a way, because these students are still having to fight for their departments in some cases to recognize the work that they're doing, and the idea that these projects are not rigorous is honestly like kind of insulting, I think. They're so deeply rigorous, they're so thoughtful, they're so interesting. Like, if there's something that makes me want to dig in and learn about, I don't know, like Chinese film in the 50s, which is something that I don't know anything about at all, like if that's written in a way that makes me want to dig in, then great, like that's fantastic. And so it's very frustrating to me that these conversations around like, opening up the dissertation, around tenure and promotion practices, that this has been happening, these conversations have been happening for decades, these norms are decided by people. We can change them. It's just a question of like how to actually make that happen and how to make that cultural change be something that feels normative instead of fringe. So I think that allowing that space is what it's for. Like, we don't know what it's going to be for. We don't know what kinds of research and connections people are going to draw. And that's what is fantastic. I think it's really inspiring that students are bringing ideas to their professors that their professors don't always know how to engage with. Like, that's what it should be. We should be seeing new connections, new possibilities that we didn't expect. And so even like when I think in a more instrumental way, when I think about my own career path, a lot of times I'll remark to students that I wouldn't have even known how to talk about the kinds of roles that I've held over the past 10 or 15 years. I didn't have a framework for even thinking about that as a possibility, let alone envisioning that pathway for myself. And I think that the same is true of research. And I mean, to connect it back to the question of indeterminacy, I think that's one of the reasons why holding that space open is so important. And I think that higher ed in general tends to, so odd to me that, you know, curiosity is what brings so many people to graduate education in the first place. And then once you're in grad school, so much of the pathway is really rigidly conscribed and doesn't allow for a whole lot of shifting. And so I think for me the most inspiring possibility is that we don't necessarily know what it's for. And I think that that's good.
Especially if it's funded so that we can have that
Yes.
period of excellence.